I had ECT because at the time my doctors did not recognize that I was having two problems. I initially had psychosis, and they did not recognize that it was secondary to fungal hepatic encephalopathy. Some people, you might have known that or heard of that as like brewery syndrome, where your body is making alcohol. Although I had never tasted alcohol, my brain was basically marinating in alcohol because of the amount of fungal byproducts I had in my system.
And so did they misdiagnose that as depression?
Well, initially they misdiagnosed it as bipolar with psychosis. And then because the psychiatric medications made me worse and my psychosis was no longer contingent on mood, they decided that my real diagnosis was schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type with catatonia. And when I didn't respond to the medications, they said, we need to give you shock treatment.
So today I am glad to be joined by Sara Price Hancock. She is a prominent figure in the movement advocating for ECT harms, and she's going to be sharing her story today. But Sara, before we kind of jump into all of that, I'd like you just to introduce yourself, just briefly sort of catch the audience up on the kind of work and advocacy that you do.
Certainly. So I am a certified rehabilitation counselor and a former professor of clinical psychiatric rehabilitation at San Diego State University. While I was doing my graduate work, I needed to understand how to return to work because I was living with ECT injury. I had just quit ECT against medical advice the year before I started my graduate program. And I knew the only way I would be able to be successful in that program was if I were able to access appropriate, requisite academic accommodations. The only way I could get academic accommodations was if I were to get comprehensive neuropsych evaluation and also the physical, evaluation for some of the problems that I was having. For example, with the electricity traverses the entire spine, and I have spinal issues, so I needed a special chair. At the time, I was not using a wheelchair. I needed a special chair, and I needed some adaptive equipment. And the only way to get that equipment was if I could prove that I needed it. And so until that point, my psychiatrist had categorically refused any referral for comprehensive assessments for balance or vision or neuropsych testing regarding my memory, because they kept saying my memory would come back. And a year of this, I was like, dude, sorry, but it hasn't yet come back, and I want to move on with my life. And so my outpatient psychiatrist was a gem, and he was like, you know what, Sara, you're doing so well. You've always wanted to go to graduate school. You need to go to graduate school. I'll refer you for the comprehensive neuropsych testing. So I did the comprehensive neuropsych testing, and the results were such that they identified mild cognitive impairment. They identified that it took me an inordinate amount of time to, at the time, find my words even, and also to read and process information. And so because I fell so far off the standard of normalcy in these tests, I was qualified to have double time on my tests, double what my peers had. And I qualified to have all of my lectures recorded so that I could review those lectures later after class. And I qualified for a note taker so that I could have someone else concentrate on taking notes, because my coordination of writing while processing information I was hearing had been severely compromised. And this was a huge standard, like massive deviation from my baseline, because prior to ECT, I had not only graduated with a pretty decent GPA, all things considered. I didn't quite meet the honors category, but I did a great job at BYU. And I had, I forget what I was thinking. Oh, when I was at BYU, I had actually volunteered with the university as a university interpreter for campus events and devotionals and plays and, those kinds of things. So I was actually interpreting in American Sign Language at the university level. And so that requires a lot of, processing your language, understanding what you're saying, and then being able to coordinate your muscle movement, coordinate the motor output in response to the sensory input. And I had lost that capacity entirely. And so now I couldn't even listen to a lecture and take notes to keep up with the lecture. So gratefully, the university found someone in my classes, and I owe them so much because they took all notes. They shared with me all of their notes, and I was able to participate and graduate on time because I was given these academic accommodations. I did so well in my program, and I had such remarkable professors and cohort. They basically decided to use me as their case study for our 3-year program. And so any time any student needed assistance, needed a volunteer person with a psychiatric disorder to do a case study on, or to, do an assessment for, or such as that, they frequently chose me. And so consequently, I was connected with assistive technology that typically aren't given to people at that time, because I had students who were doing comprehensive assessments and then writing well-documented reports, well-researched, well-documented reports. So I was able to use a lot of assistive technology.
So let me ask this just to focus in.
Yes.
Why did you end up getting ECT?
That's a good question. I had ECT because at the time my doctors did not recognize that I was having 2 problems. I initially had a psychosis, and they did not recognize that it was secondary to hepatic encephalopathy. And so I had a fungal infection, and basically I had I guess it was fungal hepatic encephalopathy. And some people, you might have known that or heard of that as brewery syndrome, where your body is making alcohol. And so though I had never tasted alcohol, my brain was basically marinating in alcohol because of the amount of fungal byproducts I had in my system.
And so did they misdiagnose that as depression?
Well, initially they misdiagnosed it as bipolar with psychosis. And then because the psychiatric medications made me worse and my psychosis was no longer contingent on mood, then they decided that my real diagnosis was schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type with catatonia. And so I didn't respond to the medications. And when I didn't respond to the medications, they said, we need to give you shock treatment.
And how long was it between when you started having symptoms and when you got ECT? Was that like several months? What was the time course? Yeah.
So my very first psychotic break was in right after I'd returned from my mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Within like 3 months, I got really bad pneumonia when I was at BYU. And so they put me on antibiotics. And soon thereafter, I had my first psychotic break. And I was taken off the BYU campus by campus security and taken to the hospital there close to BYU. And they looked at, all of my symptoms, and they knew that I had a family member who was I had 2 family members who had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So they assumed that that was my diagnosis and went with it. There was no recognition that I didn't have these symptoms before the antibiotic, and there was no like spinal tap or, anything of that nature.
Okay. And so when you got ECT, do you remember what they told you about it?
No.
Okay.
But from 98, so what happened was I was first diagnosed and medicated in 98. And then I was able to return to BYU and complete my degree. It took me an exponentially longer time, but that was in 98. I finally graduated from BYU in 2002 in April. And then that following December is when they were like, you know what, we've tried every medication that's available at this time. And so we need to try something else. And so it wasn't until December of 2002 that I was first given shock treatments.
And how many treatments were you given in your first round?
My first round, I was given, let's see, I only recently got my medical notes. I was given more than 50, if I remember correctly. The problem was, I wasn't responding to the ECT. And so they just kept giving me back-to-back acute courses of ECT. So that's 3 times a week, 3 times a week, 3 times a week, twice a week, twice a week, once a week. Okay, she's not getting better. 3 times a week, 3 times a week, twice a week, twice a week, once a week. Oh, she's not getting better. Basically, they were the living embodiment of Einstein's definition of insanity.
And so were you injured after that first round, or did you undergo subsequent rounds of ECT?
I suspect that I was injured in that first round. My parents indicate that I was injured in that first round. I speak this kind of like as a third person because by the time I had the second round of ECT and finished that was from 2002 to 2009. By the time I was finished with that, I had erased the first 34 years of my life, the life experience of the first 36 years of my life. So I don't know if you can see it, but on this bookcase behind me, I have 38 volumes of journals. And so I basically pieced together my life based on the journals that I wrote since I was 12.
Okay. And, I know you've had spinal injury now from the shock treatment. Was that apparent after the first rounds, or was that something that emerged later on?
I really couldn't tell you. I know that it wasn't until I started having I need help, because what had happened is something had happened in my lumbar spine. And so what we didn't know and what nobody really discusses is that ECT is an electrical injury. There are no rubber bumpers in your brain to prevent the electricity from traversing the spine and your entire nervous system. There are no rubber bumpers to keep, your electrical stimulation in a specific spot. And you're putting nearly an amp into not only the nervous system, but the entire cerebrovascular system and vascular system. So this is electricity that's not only impacting the brain, but it's also, activating the what's it called? What's the word? The vagal, the trigeminal